Thank you, Jim. Matthew chapter 24, verse 4, talking about the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem and events surrounding the end of the world. Jesus answered, verse 4, and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come, verse 5, in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Verse 11, many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. Verse 24, Matthew 24, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. 4 times in Matthew 24 and 1 time in Revelation chapter 13, Jesus has warned us to beware that we are not deceived. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 14, talking about the first beast, or excuse me, not the first beast, but the second beast of America. It says in verse 14, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. So America will be foremost in seeking to deceive all the world into believing a lie. Now, this afternoon, what I'd like to take a look at, maybe some of you hopefully remember a few years ago, back in the late 1990s, there was a war going on in the area of southeastern Europe. Does anybody remember who that war was with? Bosnia, okay. What was the name of the country? Yugoslavia, okay. And we heard words like Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Herzegovina, Sarajevo, Montenegro. And then we heard about a leader, and his name was Slobodan. Does anybody remember his last name? Milosevic. Okay, Slobodan Milosevic, and he was coined in the public press. I still remember a USA Today, and it had a headline. It said, The Butcher of the Balkans. The Butcher of the Balkans. And of course it was talking about the leader of the Serbs, the Orthodox Christians, and his name was Slobodan Milosevic. Well, you know, as we read in our Secret Terrorist, that was an out-and-out lie. Slobodan Milosevic was not a good leader. There are no good leaders today. But he was not the butcher of the Balkans. And we're going to take a look this afternoon at who was and who has been for the last nearly 1,000 years the butcher of the Balkans. Now, let's nail down a few terms before we get started. Number one, we talk about Croats or Croatia or Croatians. Does anybody know what that term means? Anybody know? Okay. The Croats are the Roman Catholics of the area of Yugoslavia. I'll never forget when I was a freshman in college in Sunnyvale, California, I had to do a speech. And so I was paired up with this young lady, and so I was asking her all kinds of questions to do this speech about her, and she told me that her ancestors were from Croatia. And I thought, what in the world is Croatia? Well, in my study, I have found out that Croatians are Catholics. Now, how about Serbs or Serbians? Who are they? Okay, they are Eastern Orthodox Christians. That's correct. The Serbs, of course, migrated into the area of southeastern Europe that we know of today as Yugoslavia. But the way that the Serbs became Eastern Orthodox Christians, does anybody know anything about that? Okay. Back in the 11th century, the Catholic Church in the western part of Europe got into a conflict with the Catholic Church in the eastern part of Europe. And one of the issues that they had a disagreement over was the seventh-day Sabbath. The Eastern Orthodox, or the Eastern Christians, believed they should keep the seventh-day Sabbath. The Western Catholic Church said they ought to keep Sunday. So a conflict arose, and in 1054, Pope Leo X anathematized the Eastern European Catholic Church and called them Orthodox heretics or Orthodox Christian heretics. That's how they received their name. They were Eastern Orthodox Christians. That happened in 1054 AD. From that time on, from 1054, for the last 1,000 years, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church have been implacable enemies. Now, if you analyze the history of Russia in the 20th century, the slaying of Tsar Nicholas and his wife Alexandra and all their family in 1918, when you analyze the purgings of Joseph Stalin, of Lenin before him, and then of Khrushchev and other Russian leaders, the primary focus of those purgings was to eliminate the Eastern Orthodox Church. That has been the primary goal. And of course, you can see the hand of the papacy behind all of those purgings, because it's the Catholic Church who wants to destroy the Orthodox Church. When you look at what's gone on in Armenia, when you look at what's gone on in Yugoslavia, whenever you hear in the press about the death or the slayings of Orthodox Christians, you can be sure that the papacy is behind it. Now, I want to read something to you. I was amazed when I went back to my bookcase. I have got several books here that all talk about the same thing. And this one too. This first one is called The Vatican Against Europe by Edmund Paris, where he talks about World War I and II and how the papacy ignited both of those wars to destroy Protestants and Orthodox Christians. This book by Avro Manhattan is called The Vatican's Holocaust, and this book focuses specifically on the papacy's attempt to annihilate the Serbs of Yugoslavia during World War II. That's what this book is all about. This book right here by Edmund Paris, same author who wrote The Vatican Against Europe, this one is called Convert or Die, and this book specifically deals also with the Catholic Church and their attempt to destroy the Serbian Orthodox Christians of Yugoslavia during World War II. That's all that this book is about. And then finally, I've got this one other book here by Monica Farrell, Had to be a photocopy, but the book is called Ravening Wolves by Monica Farrell. And Miss Farrell in this book shows conclusively the ravening wolves of the Vatican and of the Jesuit order as they killed 1.7 million Serbs during World War II, during a 3-year period, 1941 to 1943. See, when we talk about World War II, and we will talk more about it in a few moments, but all we think about, as soon as you think World War II and you think of something terrible, the first name that comes to your mind is who? Hitler. Of course. World War II, awful, Hitler. First thing you think of. But how many of you have ever heard of a man by the name of Ante Pavlovich? How many? Paul, you have. Pat? Okay, Graham? A few of you have. But most of us have never heard of the guy. Well, he was the leader of Catholic Yugoslavia during World War II, and 1.7 million Serbians were killed. Now, I didn't say 1542 in the Dark Ages. I didn't say 842 in the days of the feudal lords of Europe. I said 1942. 60 years ago, this went on in our enlightened world. The butchery of a group of people in Yugoslavia during World War II. And this was the slogan, convert to Catholicism or die. Now, from Edmund Paris's book, Convert or Die, he gives some history about the Serbs and their migrations up into the area of southeastern Europe. He says this on pages 9 through 11. I'm going to quote just portions. It says, in the Middle Ages, the Serbs had their own independent nation, occupying the area of what is now the southern part of Yugoslavia. After their defeat by the Turks, now the Turks were Islamic during the Middle Ages, so when we talk of the Turks, we're talking about Islam or the Muslims. It says, after the Serbs were defeated by the Turks, the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, they began moving northward, entering regions under the rule of Hungary, hoping to live to fight another day on behalf of Christianity and freedom. This Serbian emigration reached considerable proportions after the fall of Serbian ruler Brankovic in 1459. The Hungarian kings used the Serbs in the struggles they had to defend their borders from the Turks, because the Serbs were known as able and competent soldiers. So the Austria-Hungarian Empire, they used the Serbs as human shields. You see? And so the Serbs were along the southern area of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, and as the Muslim Turks would come north to try to attack Austria and Hungary, the Serbs were used to fight the Muslim Turks. And so the Serbians became very useful, very effective soldiers that protected the Austria-Hungarian kingdom. Now, the Austrians and the Hungarians were predominantly of what religious background? They were Catholic. But why did they allow the Serbians into their land? Because they would protect them from the Muslims coming into their country. So they allowed the Serbs to stay there as protection. All right, going on from Paris' book, it says, the Austrian authorities were glad to have them because they did not come as ordinary refugees, but they came as warriors willing to continue the fight against the infidel Turk. But the Turkish occupation was to last some 500 years. In the meantime, the Serbs became valuable citizens, settled in their new home, although they often had to pay a dear price for living on the frontier, exposed to periodic Turkish military onslaughts. Folks, something that we don't understand. In fact, Martin Luther wrote about it. All during the Dark Ages, the Muslims constantly were trying to come up into Europe and take over Catholic Europe. Constantly. Martin Luther wrote about it. Charles V, many times when it looked like Charles V was going to stomp out the Reformation, all of a sudden the Turks came in from the south or from the east, and Charles V had to stop fighting the Protestants and had to go after the infidel Muslim Turks. But the Muslims played a key role throughout the Dark Ages in keeping the Catholic Church at bay. Going on, it says, to the north of the Serbs was Croatia, a strongly Catholic land. Life was difficult there for anyone who was not a Catholic. The Catholic bishops, with the help of the Viennese Jesuits, sought constantly to convert the newly arrived Serbs to Catholicism, or to at least get them to accept the Unite rite. Many times the attempts were aided by military authorities using brute force, although the Austrian kings were officially and formally on the side of the Serbs. So the Jesuits tried to convert the Serbs to Catholicism, but the Serbs would have nothing to do with it. Finally, as time went on, 18th century, the Croatians, Catholics, feared the progress the Serbs were making in religion, economics, education, and culture. The Croatians were determined to do something about it. In the 1700s, they instructed the Catholic representatives in the Hungarian Parliament to enact laws and regulations which would make life impossible for the Serbian people and for the Orthodox Church. Maria Theresa, a Catholic leader, rejected these demands because the Serbian military power was needed in the struggle against the Turks. But once Maria Theresa passed off the scene, and another century went by, finally in the late 1800s. The late 1800s, the Roman Catholics, the Croatians, started rising and becoming more and more powerful and gaining greater and greater control. It says one Croatian, who was called the father of his country, made this statement about the Serbs. The Serbs are a breed fit only for the slaughterhouse. He made another statement saying, Serbs to the willows, meaning that the Serbs should be hung on willow trees. Now that was in the late 1800s. So you can see from those statements from Paris' book, by the end of the 1800s and going into the 1900s, the Croatians were getting more and more volatile and more desirous of annihilating the Serbs out of Yugoslavia and the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Now, does somebody remember what started the First World War? Okay. There was an assassination. And the man who was assassinated was the heir to the Catholic Austria-Hungarian throne. His name was Archduke Ferdinand. He was assassinated in a Serbian city named Sarajevo. And the person who they claim killed him and his wife was of, guess what nationality? He was an Orthodox Serb. And so as a result of this assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914, Franz Joseph, who was the king of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, was pushed by the Roman Catholic Church to declare war on the Serbs for allowing one of their own to kill Archduke Ferdinand. And so as a result of this assassination and the pushing of the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order of Franz Joseph, World War I began. Now in Edmund Paris's book, and it's also in this book, is Alberto for Real by Sidney Hunter. I want to read from this. He states it this way, and this is from Paris's book, The Vatican Against Europe, page 47. Pope Pius X, in his hatred against Orthodox Christians, was continually inciting Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary to chastise the Serbians. After Sarajevo on July 26, 1914, that's when Archduke Ferdinand was killed, Baron Ritter, Bavarian representative of the Catholic Church, wrote to his government, "The Pope approves of Austria's harsh treatment of Serbia. He has no great opinion of the armies of Russia and France in the event of a war against Germany. The Cardinal Secretary of State does not see when Austria could make war if she does not decide to do so now. There in the true colors is the Vicar of Christ, the gentle apostle of peace, the holy pontiff whom pious authors represent as having died of sorrow at seeing the outbreak of the First World War." So who pushed Franz Joseph to chastise the Serbs during World War I? The Catholic Church. Now, who was it that incited George Bush to go into Operation Iraqi Freedom? Who pushed it? The Catholic Church. And of course, what we have heard from the controlled press of the Jesuit order is that, John Paul II was speaking out in St. Peter's in Rome and saying how awful the war would be if America went against Iraq. How many innocent people would be killed, and how terrible the Pope would feel to see bloodshed. When in actuality, folks, the truth of the matter is that papal representatives, Jesuits, were pushing George Bush and Saddam Hussein into that very conflict. Revelation 18:24 says, "And in her, Babylon the Great, was found the blood of saints and of prophets and of all that were slain upon the earth." So pious authors, Roman Catholic, Jesuit authors, people controlled by the Roman Church are going to tell you before any conflict that the papacy was full of sorrow over the conflict, when in actuality they were behind the scenes planning every move that was going to be made. Page 47 again of Paris' book, also in is Alberto for Real, page 30 of this book. It says, "Thus it is proved that Pius X and his Secretary of State, when they encouraged the most Catholic Emperor Franz Joseph to make war, were coldly contemplating the consequences of their act. A conflict which would set the Central European empires against France and Russia. They believed they had accurately estimated the strength of the different forces, but what His Holiness and his accomplice had not foreseen was the participation in the War of England and finally of the entire Anglo-Saxon world, a participation which was to thwart their plans, tip the scales in favor of France, and liberate the Orthodox populations from the Viennese yoke. One may say quite specifically that in 1914 the Roman Church started the hellish series of wars. It was then that the tribute of blood which she has always taken from the peoples began to swell to a veritable torrent." You say, "Bill, but Alberto Rivera, I've heard a lot of bad things about that guy. You can't believe what you hear about Alberto Rivera and what he says. Just because he says that Franz Joseph was incited by the papacy to start World War I, you can't believe him. And Edmund Paris, nobody's heard of Edmund Paris. You know what, folks? People have told me that, and they say, how do you know that this guy and this guy are telling the truth when there's a million other books that say to the contrary? How do you know that these are right and the other books are wrong? That's easy. These books simply explain the principle outlined in Revelation 18, verse 24. That's all they do. They make plain what Revelation 18:24 says. Revelation 18:24 claims emphatically that the Vatican has been behind all wars, all bloodshed throughout the ages. And these books say the exact same thing. That's why these books are right. And all the other million books that never mention the papacy and the Jesuits and their role in war are absolute liars. Now, in another book by Avro Manhattan called The Vatican Billions, if you don't have Avro Manhattan's books, you really ought to get them. This guy was a British journalist for the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC. This man did what Seventh-day Adventists should have done, but didn't. That's what Avro Manhattan did. Avro Manhattan tells in this book that because of his book called The Vatican's Holocaust, in which he talked about how the Croats sought to destroy the Serbs in World War II, Avro Manhattan almost was shot, almost was assassinated for writing this book. Avro Manhattan again did what Seventh-day Adventists should have done and wrote many, many books on the papacy and what they have done to destroy truth in the world. In his book, page 124 and 125, Avro Manhattan says this: it says, with the fall of Tsarist Russia and the advent of atheistic Bolshevism, the Catholic Church saw a vast panorama of such double conquest open before her eyes. The Russian Orthodox Church, having identified herself with the Tsars, was second only to the crown in prestige, power, and possessions. Her wealth was colossal. The overthrow of the Tsarist system in Russia, therefore, brought with it the inevitable overthrow of the established Orthodox Church. Why was Nicholas killed in 1918? Well, Avro Manhattan just told why. If the Tsar system in Russia, which supported the Orthodox Church in Russia. If it was dismantled and destroyed, then who would protect the Orthodox Church from Rome? Nobody. And so with the Tsarist system being overthrown, the papacy could move in with her Jesuit agents, Lenin and Stalin and the rest of them, to destroy Russian Orthodox Christendom. To the Vatican, which had waged war against the Orthodox Church since the 11th century, the downfall of her millenarian rival was too good to be true. The evil of Bolshevism could in this manner be accepted in view of its having destroyed the Orthodox Church, with one provision, however, that it would give Rome a free hand to finish the task of eliminating orthodoxy in Russia once and for all. So that was another reason for World War I, was to annihilate the Orthodox Church in Russia. In many, many ways, the papacy succeeded in World War I, got a tremendous amount of what they wanted. However, the Serbs still flourished in Yugoslavia. And at the end of World War I, actually, as Avril Manhattan states on page 2 of his book, The Vatican's Holocaust, on October 28, 1918, the Czechoslovakians declared their independence. On the 29th, the Yugoslavians proclaimed theirs. The new independent kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Yugoslavia, had come into being. This birth was welcomed in some places and was unwelcomed in others, especially in the Vatican. When to the above was added the fact that Yugoslavia, by her mere existence, represented the greatest obstacle to the long-range Catholic strategy, the Vatican's feeling, more than one of hostility, became one of implacable hatred, a wind which boded no good to the young nation. This hatred became the main inspirer of the Vatican's anti-Yugoslavian strategy, the objective of which was the destruction of Yugoslavia. When I read those things, do you sometimes sit back and say, I can't believe what he's reading? Do you ever get that feeling? That's impossible, that a church could be so evil and so wicked that they would plan how to annihilate, how to destroy a nation of people. Do you ever get that feeling? From 1919 to 1941, attempts were made to put the Catholic Croatian people into greater and greater control of the young nation of Yugoslavia. I think everyone understands why. Because they had to wipe out the Serbs. 1934, the king of Yugoslavia, his name was King Alexander, was seeking to make equal the Croatians and the Serbs of Yugoslavia. And in 1934, he was gunned down as he was visiting France. A man by the name of Radic, who was an honest Roman Catholic, who was a high-ranking official in the young Yugoslavian state, who was trying to do the best for all people in Yugoslavia. He was an honest Catholic. In 1928, he was murdered. Both men were killed because they stood in Rome's way. World War II gets underway. Adolf Hitler goes into Poland, goes into France, goes into Yugoslavia. And Monica Farrell, in her book called Ravening Wolves, pages 8 and 9, she says this: when Hitler's hordes swept over Yugoslavia, the government of that country declared on the side of the Allies. But a corner of Yugoslavia, in which there was a Roman Catholic majority, deflected under Roman Catholic influence and formed a puppet state, calling it the independent state of Croatia. Ante Pavelić took the reins of office and raised an army called the Ustashi, which was composed of Roman Catholic actionists. Now, Ante Pavelić was a very, very disgusting person. Ante Pavelić was one of the people involved, along with Benito Mussolini of Italy, in the planning and plotting to assassinate King Alexander in 1934. Ante Pavelić, according to Edmund Paris' book, Convert or Die, and Avro Manhattan's book, The Vatican's Holocaust, Ante Pavelić had a tremendous team of Jesuits, and they would sneak into Yugoslavia with false passports and false papers, and they would create terrorism in Yugoslavia to break down the government and the will of the people of that country. Does that sound familiar? I was amazed as I was reading these books, because these two men, writing these books 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago, they continually used the word terror, terror attacks, terrorism. And I thought, boy, they could have written these books in 2001, 2002, constantly referring to the terrorism that Ante Pavelić used in Yugoslavia prior to World War II. So Ante Pavelić was just a real disgusting, and that's the best word for him, a disgusting individual. Raised up an army called the Ustashi, which was composed of Roman Catholic actionists. And who was in this army? And I'll just tell you, it's not written here in her book, but it's in the other ones. His army was composed of Catholic priests, nuns, monks, all kinds of official Roman Catholics in positions, and they joined this terror band of cold-blooded murderers. That's what they were, cold-blooded murderers. This army was helped by other Roman Catholic armies, such as the Hungarians and the Bulgarians, who also acted in the interests of Rome. The objectives of these armies was the forceful conversion to Romanism or the annihilation of the Serbs, an ideal which could only appeal to Rome. Government officials were taken over. A notice was issued that only Roman Catholics could remain in the government service. You know what? She's talking about Yugoslavia. She could be talking about the United States today. Only people who are doing... No, I'm not going to say only, because Ellen White makes it clear that God is still using various men in high positions to give incontrovertible arguments when God's work is, there are attempts to deeply retard it. So there are still a few honest-hearted people through whom God is working in high places, but the great Balkan majority are either Roman Catholics or are people in support of what the Catholic Church is doing. All arms, listen to this, all arms, guess what happened to them? Were confiscated on the plea of safeguarding against a communist uprising. What was the plea? It was a plea for something, for the betterment and for everybody's good. Sound familiar? In villages, people were called to assemble for instructions and knew nothing of what was awaiting them. They were either shot down on the spot or taken to concentration camps to be tortured and starved. Who ran the concentration camps? Priests. Jesuit priests. Not just in Yugoslavia, in Germany, Dachau, Ravensbrück, and some of those other horrible places. They were run by Jesuit priests. In desperation, some people fled to the hills and put up a brave defense under the leadership of Marshal Tito, who eventually became the leader of Yugoslavia. This general, in a pathetic plea to the Allies to do something to stop the savage butchery of his countrymen by the Roman Catholic actionists, said, "Yugoslavia is drenched with Serb blood, and yet our Allies cannot or will not stop the flow of this blood and the mass murder of the Serbs. I do not believe it is in the interests of the Allies that the Serbian people should cease to exist. I beg the Yugoslav minister to interest our allies in the fact that the Serbs in Yugoslavia are being exterminated. Could not something more be said in broadcasts about the slaughter of the Serbs? The number so far approaches 1 million. These words were written in a dispatch sent by the general on February 5th, 1943. Why were we not told the facts over the air? Never a word was mentioned about the butchers who were led by priests and friars who themselves assisted in the tortures and slaughters of poor Serbs. The explanation is that the power of Rome in America, Britain, and the Dominions is such that in spite of wireless telegraph and supposedly free press, all these facts have been kept behind the Scarlet Curtain of Rome, which is every bit as soundproof as the Iron Curtain of Russia. It makes you wonder what's really going on in Iraq today, doesn't it? What is really going on over there? And how many lies have we been fed as far as what the people of Iraq are really suffering? We have no idea. No idea. We now know that 1.7 million Serbs were slaughtered by the Roman Catholic actionists between 1941 and 1943. How many of us ever heard about that in high school history class? None of us did. From Alberto's book, page 53. It says, among the documents that we have examined were great numbers of official Roman Catholic newspapers and periodicals, frankly telling the story from month to month of the archbishops, and the archbishop's name was Stepanek. It's very interesting. He was the archbishop of Yugoslavia all during the time the Ustashi were butchering the Serbs. And guess what? The loving and kind and enlightened popes, Pope John the 23rd, the great ecumenical pope, and Pope Paul VI, the pope who was reigned in the late 60s into the early and mid-70s, they both thought so highly of Archbishop Stepanak of Yugoslavia. It says they frankly told the story from month to month of the Archbishop's collaboration with the Nazi forces. It seemed obvious that the reason for this candid recording of such collaboration was due to the conviction that Germany would win the war. So they became bold. They thought Germany would win. So we'll make it public. We'll write everything down and tell everything about what we did. The documents showed that when the Italians and Germans swept into Yugoslavia, underground bands of previously organized Roman Catholic laymen calling themselves crusaders and aided by individual priests and militant monks rose to receive the invaders. That's called a fifth column. Pavelic, with the help of their German, Italian, and Crusader soldiers, proceeded to carry out the German-sponsored racial program, which advocated the solidifying of a Croatian community by eliminating such minorities as Jews and Gypsies, reducing the number of Serbs living in Croatia, and compelling those remaining to turn Roman Catholic. The Serbs became Roman Catholics through forced conversion or were going to die. Those who resisted were shot or stabbed, their bodies thrown into mass graves, which were subsequently found and opened. We saw hundreds of sworn depositions attesting to these crimes made out by relatives or eyewitnesses, and in a few cases by survivors. Serbian church properties were seized and turned over to Roman Catholic parishes and convents. In the total struggle in Yugoslavia, 1.7 million men, women, and children perished. Here's another book called Holocaust and the Independent State of Croatia by Dr. Lazo Kostic. He says this in his report dated September 24, 1941. Orthodox circles in Serbia are deeply embittered by Croatian conduct. The Ustashi forced tens of thousands of Serbs in Croatia to accept the Catholic faith. Those Orthodox who resisted either had their throats cut in mass, this is to be taken literally, or all their property confiscated and they were expelled totally destitute. The mass expulsion or forced conversion of the Orthodox to Roman Catholicism was on the agenda. All measures aimed at the elimination of Serbdom in Croatia were carried out under the slogan enunciated by one of the Croatian ministers. We shall massacre the first third of the Serbs, expel the second third from the country, and force the final third to accept the Catholic faith. Thus, the most official German circles personally present in Croatia at the time admit that massacres of hundreds of thousands of Serbs occurred, and the official Croatian policy was to effectuate the disappearance of Serbs from Croatia. In other words, it was genocide. I'll tell you, when I read this kind of stuff, and then I read in the Adventist Review that Myron Widmer says in 1993 that John Paul is preaching the gospel to the young people of Denver. I don't want to have my hands near Myron Widmer's neck because I want to just shake the guy and say, are you nuts? Are you crazy? Have you lost your mind? Have you gone insane? How those things can be printed in the Adventist Review, it makes you want to pick up a chair and just fling it through the air. You know, it's upsetting. It's very upsetting to hear people claiming to be Seventh-day Adventists talking about how the papacy has changed. to hear, I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember reading where he said that John Paul we ought to treat him as a fine Christian man. And then for the President of the United States to get up and say the best thing we can do to honor John Paul II, one of the world's great men. The Serbian policy didn't end with World War II. It carried on into the 1990s. A man came into the White House, trained at Georgetown University by the name of Bill Clinton. And Jesuit Bill Clinton, if you remember, in the late 1990s, was instrumental in using another Catholic organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to bomb and annihilate and massacre and destroy the Orthodox Serbs of Yugoslavia. Yeah. So what Ellen White said in The Great Controversy, what Rome could do in a time of intellectual darkness, it will be seen that she will do just as bad in an age of intellectual enlightenment. We are watching it right before our eyes, folks. The Catholic agenda for the Serbian Orthodox people and for Orthodox Christians around the world has not changed for the last 1,000 years. It is to wipe them off the face of the earth. And USA Today, that controlled newspaper, would dare to call Slobodan Milosevic the butcher of the Balkans. In light of the facts, in light of history, it's very clear that the